Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. I'm very cognizant that it's Friday for many of you. It's late night for some of us here in the US. And after a long week of classes, I'm going to try to be cognizant of time and not keep us forever. But I want us to have a great conversation about ethics and strategic communication and crisis management. But first, I want to thank all of you for attending and especially thank Michael as he organized all of this long ago. And the Sydney lecture series is really fascinating. I've been following it for a while, always in recordings though, because of the time difference. So I think it's going to be fun to actually participate in one. And there have been some phenomenal speakers before me, and I'm really flattered and honored, delighted to be a part of that esteemed group. And so I hope you will use this talk to not only help in your own research, but forward it to your students, share it widely. As soon as Michael gets it up on YouTube, we can put it on other social media as well, so that we are thinking and talking about ethics, because I think it's vital in today's world. It's beyond vital. It's crucial. It is going to make the difference between life and death for many people. And I think that's not an exaggeration. That truly is the state of the world that we live in right now. And before I go into that, I just wanted to give you a really quick bio. I know many of you, so I'm not going to bore you with a long bio, but just wanted to tell you a little bit about me and my background. I have been studying ethics for a number of years. Let's just say a lot of years. That pretty much summarizes it well enough, not giving away any age or anything. But when I started with my doctoral program at the University of Maryland back in the 1990s, I remember that I went there thinking that I wanted to learn about ethics. That was part of the whole reason I went, because I had been working as a statistical analyst for a consultancy who did a lot of very crisis prone clients. My main client responsibility at the time was Philip Morris, and I hate cigarette smoke. I'm allergic to it personally, but this was my main client responsibility. And I spent a few years doing their data analytics and strategic recommendations. And there was never once a mention or discussion of ethics. And it was very hard for me to really know how to navigate that environment. So that's why I went to the University of Maryland for my doctorate. But at the time, I was thinking we would do a lot of ethical discussions. And really, we didn't do that much. We had one class, but when I talked to Jim Grunig about it, where's ethics in the excellence theory? He said, oh, it's in there. It's in there. And I said, where? I don't see it. He said, oh, it's part of symmetry. We baked it in. It's in everything. And this is such a fun discussion to have at the time because, you know, Jim Grunig he still is a great friend, mentor, luminary. But I said, I don't think so. I really think we need more than just saying it's kind of included as part of dialogue. I think we need to really talk about what it means, what is ethical behavior, and how to study it. And he said, well, we really haven't done that. We'll think about it. And so eventually a book chapter came out that mentioned it, but still not a lot of in-depth study. And so I thought, this is what brought me to grad school, and I still can't find it. So I'm going to create it. I'm going to have to start doing this myself. So because I speak a little German, I was able to go back to some texts and read some Kant, read lots of other philosophy. And I think it was a really fantastic way to sort of kick off a new discussion in our field. We had a few ethics studies by Don Wright, Cornelius Pratt, Tom Bivens, but by and large, and Ron Pearson, of course, but by and large, we didn't have anybody truly focusing on just ethics. It was sort of also ran to they're studying pedagogy or crisis or something else. And so I was really delighted to be able to try and get many of those studies just on ethics published. And it was really hard because there wasn't a whole lot of literature to cite. And a lot of times I wound up with very diverse sources in my literature review that drew the wrath of reviewers because they were from business or sociology or other areas. But it's been a fun process, and I'm glad that I've finally gotten, I think, sort of what we call sort of this body of knowledge of ethics in public relations. And there are lots of scholars studying it now and specializing in it now. And I'm delighted to hear that some of you have already started in that process, that you're including ethics in your crisis management or your theses, your dissertations. It's really phenomenal to hear that. So after doing my PhD at Maryland, I was on the faculty a couple different places. I went back to the University of Maryland, then to Syracuse University in the Newhouse School, and finally wound up at the University of South Carolina, which is an awesome place. And I have started a new organization here. It's a nonprofit called the Global Strategic Communication Consortium. And one of the main things we do is study and talk about ethics. And we combine that with futurism, meaning various technological changes, but not just technology. So it's not only AI, for example, it's pandemics, social challenges, wars, other crises, water shortages, energy problems. So anything that can affect the future of our field we're trying to study. So that has been keeping me enormously busy, and I'm glad to be at that point, but I'm really happy to come here and talk about ethics a little more in depth tonight. So what I had wanted to do, rather than just sit here and talk and talk and talk, I did pull up the readings that I offered for you guys so I can touch on those briefly, but I'd like to open it up to questions and discussions relatively expeditiously after that, because I think that's really a more exciting way to learn and break new ground, is in conversation with people who care deeply about this topic. And you wouldn't be here if you didn't. So I want to learn from you just as much as you learn from me. And I hope we can have a great discussion around these topics. And I love throwing out some provocative topics and great examples. I want to hear from your examples and your situations as well. I mean, it's wonderful to have someone in Ukraine here. I can't believe it. I'm honored and flattered. And we have so many conflicts and crises going on right now. That's one of the reasons that I put crisis as part of this talk, because I feel like the context of the world right now is crisis, wars, conflict, rapid technological changes that many people don't understand or can't work with or even fear. And it's changing the workforce as well. And so I think in terms of ethics, that's nothing new, right? We've had the inventing of the printing press really changed the world, because before that time, not many people were literate, and you had an aristocracy and a learned class, a landholding class who was literate, and everybody else was rather subservient. We saw a tremendous change when people started to become literate because of printing on a mass scale. Then, of course, we've had mass migrations. We've had the Industrial Revolution, before that, the Agricultural Revolution. So there are a lot of previous contexts for the world to change through crisis and challenge. But one of the problems every time we have a world war or a massive pandemic or some type of rapid technological change is that ethics often becomes an afterthought. People race forward with the technology, or people respond to the challenge, crisis, plague, illness, whatever it is. People respond. And oftentimes that response is without critical thinking. It's without moral reflection, and certainly without the type of analyses that we would call ethical. And sometimes you have no choice in that matter. Sometimes it's Maslow's hierarchy of survival. But we always find that when we look at situations and think about the ethics, we often have a better response. And that's true across various contexts. So with business, it's true, but it's normally true with everything. So looking at the pandemic response, for example, some colleagues and I published an article on all of the misunderstanding and all of the rollout was very bumpy of the vaccines, and then the CDC guidelines kept changing and people were generally confused, because I don't think anyone ever stopped to say, let's think about what we should do to make this the most effective response to a global crisis that is imaginable. How can we make this more ethical? How can we make it equitable for all people? And it's not based on your affluence, your rural versus urban status, your accomplishments, your socioeconomic status. It's not based on that. It's based on what we consider to be true veracity, helping people respond to what might be the planet's biggest challenge at the time. And I think looking back on the ethics of that situation, there were very few ethics involved in that situation, right? And I'm not critiquing any particular administration, government, etc., but I do believe that we can each point to numerous things that were done in a poor manner, done without authenticity, veracity, honesty, or were even done with outright manipulation, and were not done on a level of making informed choices and offering people the dignity and respect that's their inherent right as critical thinkers. So that's just one example. I am going to share my screen briefly. I know that most of you have probably done the readings that I sent across to Michael in advance, or maybe you have taken a quick look at them now. But I just wanted to cover a few basic things to get us all on the same page. I've talked about the language of studying ethics, of talking about ethics, and of using ethics in public relations. And I have a table in this reading. This is the Bowen and Lavari crisis management reading that Michael had. And I think this one really helps get us on the same level playing field. We have a ton of people who are all the time calling for transparency in public relations. You've heard this. You've heard it all the time. You've probably heard people on the news talking about transparency. You've probably heard your government's cabinet administrators talking about transparency and so on. But the problem with transparency in my research, which was before this article, goes a little beyond it, people oftentimes use transparency to obfuscate the ethical problem that they don't want to disclose. And I've had people actually tell me in my qualitative research, yes, we just did a big data dump and we hoped that no reporter was going to be industrious enough to look through all of that and find our toxic chemicals were leaking into the water supply, etc. So you can see how transparency could be used as a veil or a smokescreen in terms of not being the highest ethical standard. And when we talk about deontological theory, we're really looking for those highest ethical standards. It's a normative and idealist philosophy, but that drives us toward a better implementation in the real world. It doesn't mean we're perfect, but it does mean that we're thinking about our reactions and trying to measure them in a way that's in accordance with the highest standards of moral philosophy. And I think that this particular example with transparency is my favorite because everyone has heard calls for transparency. Transparency itself is just not enough. Transparency alone is okay, but if you don't know what to look for, the transparency is going to be worthless. And so I also like to talk about disclosure and full contextual disclosure as an ethical standard that goes beyond transparency, because transparency itself can be used with malice. It can be used with ignorance, with amoral intent. But any of those things don't rise to the level of ethical standard that we would say is reversible, maintains dignity and respect, and decision-making autonomy for those who are involved in the decision and need the information that has accuracy and honesty to make decisions for their own lives. And so that was one thing I wanted to point out with this chart. The other is that we don't want to just rely on legalism. We have a lot of wonderful public relations legal scholars out there, and they do fantastic work in helping us interpret our legal statutes and torts and guidelines for every country in which we do business, oftentimes multinational and global standards as well. But legal implementation always follows ethical standards. If you think about slavery, for example, in the United States, we had an abolitionist movement underground. It started in churches as a religious movement and then grew because of the moral standard of people thinking that slavery was abhorrent and it needed to be abolished. That was well in advance of a legal standard. So slavery remained legal for a good 30 years after that began. But sometimes ethics just has to be bold and do things that are not technically legal. So those abolitionists were risking life, limb, and property by building the Underground Railroad to free slaves, for example. But they did this anyway because they felt like it was their moral duty. And so to me, that's ethically praiseworthy, even though it's not legal behavior. So this is why we don't rely on legal standards, and hopefully we don't just have a law and ethics class where it's all combined together into one course where they really just focus on legal standards and what's ethical within the Bar Association. But we go further into talking about moral philosophy. We have classes for our students where they get to specialize in public relations ethics. So it's not journalism ethics, mass media ethics, and law. It really does talk about our field. And so that's something that I thought was really important in terms of the terminology. And most of you are probably very familiar with that terminology, so I'm going to leave that reading going forward. But this one does bring up a lot about crisis management that I want to touch on in a few moments, so we can always return to that. The next reading that I have pulled up is not actually one that I had shared with Michael, but this is a public affairs reading that I think is very important in terms of ethics, dealing with crisis and public policy and the constant state of warfare that we seem to be living in today. I thought this one might be good to bring to your attention. This particular chapter was for the Handbook of Public Affairs, and I believe that it really does translate what we do into the public policy arena quite well. Public relations practitioners oftentimes report that they do not have public policy level access, though. And so this reading points out that around 35% of our public relations professionals say, yes, I do have some say in public policy, and somewhere around 65%, depending on who you ask. This sample, 65% said that they do not have any say in public policy as the highest ranking CCO, or the person reporting to the CEO as the highest ranking public relations person. They don't get a say in public policy. And so that is a very concerning fact to me, because we understand what's going on around an organization in a very different context than those who work in the legal department or the marketing department, who has some understanding, but they specialize in consumers and sales. They really don't talk about government and public policy, our responsibilities to government regulatory agencies, to consumer publics who are not necessarily linked to us by a stakeholder concern, but by a public policy concern. We have a lot of community relations knowledge that those folks don't always have. So I believe that we're the ones to help an organization at the policy level by discussing the points of this triangle, which I'm sure those of you who've seen my work before are familiar with the deontological triangle. This is Kant's categorical imperative as translated to strategic communication and the language that we use in the field. So thinking about duty, our emphasis on moral principle and responsibility, dignity and respect for all of those involved around a decision or who are impacted by the decision or who should have a say in that decision, and intention or acting from a morally goodwill, meaning doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do out of good intention, not from pure profit motive, self-interest, greed, avarice, or any of the other things that could taint those decisions. And then, of course, we have some broad groups. These can be further segmented into smaller stakeholder groups, but thinking about yourself, your public society, your primary stakeholders, and the organization itself, maintaining your duty, your dignity and respect, and the intention of all of those in the center of the triangle as well. So this reading, I did not send it to you guys, but I did want to touch on it because it has the problem of corruption blatantly discussed as part of a government and public affairs publication. We do see a lot of corruption nowadays, and we have to wonder, is it a wicked problem at this point? I believe that corruption in government really does get to the level of becoming a wicked problem, and those are really the intractable problems that we can't solve through simple decision making in one organization or even as one society. It's more of a global issue. It's a global problem that persists. Even when we solve it in one country, it may have worsened in another country in that same time period. And so I think this is why we do ethics. This is a great rationale for thinking about ethics and bringing it into all of those decisions that we are facing every day. But we have to realize we're not going to be able to solve every unethical act or every problem, every manipulation, for every influence bot that's out there spewing propaganda. We may be able to solve one problem in our own organizations, but we can't solve all of those problems. And so I think that has persisted throughout the study of ethics. Some philosophers have called it the problem of evil. Others have called it a flaw of human nature. Others have correlated it more with power, that absolute power always corrupts because people will seek their own influence when they have the power not to be countered. And is that necessarily ubiquitous? Probably. It's pretty close, right? So I think that might be a wicked problem that we're facing, but we can certainly try to help solve these issues. Now, in the reading from the International Encyclopedia of Strategic Communication, excuse me, I included this one because it's a very simple, quick read about strategic communication ethics. For those of you who didn't have a lot of time to do pre-reading and study, or those who are busy teaching, I know you're probably all doing that. This one gives a very brief synopsis of how ethics in strategic communication works. Essentially, our responsibilities of the organization, making sure that we're maintaining dignity and respect for all publics, we're acting with universal moral rectitude, and so on. So this particular framework extends to everything we're doing in terms of ethical behavior. So if we're designing a new diversity, equity, inclusion initiative, this particular form of ethics can help us do that, because it really says we have to maintain dignity and respect for all involved publics, and do so because of good intention. So actually giving them a sense of belonging rather than giving them a sense of you're included as a placeholder, but giving them a sense of belonging because it's the right thing to do. And I believe this reading is probably the simplest. Since it's an encyclopedia entry, I thought you might appreciate having something very simple to go with. And then finally, I wanted to show you a couple of things that summarize what I've said in terms of crisis management. Since we are in a a perpetual crisis state, some scholars have called it. Other scholars have called it perma-crisis. Others have just called it the new normal. However you would like to frame it, the world has become increasingly complex, and it's probably a lot due to rapid technological and societal changes as well. We've had the stress of the pandemic, but we've also had an explosion in international travel in the past 50 years that really made the world a smaller place. Therefore, we have the complexities that arise from that travel. We have a lot of international business taking place, even with medium-sized level businesses. No longer is it just the Fortune 500. Many companies of every size have to do international relations. Some in the US, even with their employees, because we've had such a huge migration explosion in the past couple of years. Now we're having organizations that have to translate their policies into Spanish very rapidly and train in Spanish, where they had never conceived of doing that just 10 years ago. And so these changes make us think about the pressures that are on an organization and the many things that can go wrong. They do give us a sense that issues management or proactive problem solving, identification, looking at trends is more important than ever before, because we really have so many more pressures on us now from so many different levels. So it's interpersonal, it's societal. We also have the healthscape that's a problem. We also have wars and conflicts and pressures internationally from various different countries. We're trying to keep out of wars and conflicts, but it seems like they are erupting more commonly now than in the past. And now we also have the pressures from the technological changes that are taking place very rapidly. One of the problems that I see as an ethicist is that we now have these cyber sovereigns, is what they're generally called in that literature, such as Meta and Google and X or Twitter. They have tremendous amounts of influence. Meta has a larger GDP than some of the smaller European countries, for example. But Meta has no oversight. In other words, they are making their own ethics up as they go. They have not been very successful in trying to hold to any of the standards of governing bodies of the countries in which they operate. The European Union's tried very hard. They've tried different means of reining in Meta's influence. But in the US, Meta's influence has been practically unlimited until very recently. In other words, just completely unconstrained. So this loops back to the problem I was talking about earlier. When we have giant cyber sovereigns with absolute free reign, total autonomy, and no control, what happens ethically? Normally the ethics follow, right? Like we've seen in the past where we respond to wars, health crises, plagues. Normally you're in response mode and ethics follow, and we think, oh, why didn't we think of that before? Why have we allowed this huge abridgment of rights and freedom and privacy? Why didn't we think of that before? And it seems like when we are thinking of these things post hoc, after it's happened, it's very easy to point to the ethical pitfalls, right? But why don't we try and think of those pitfalls beforehand and guard against them? That's a little more difficult, and it takes a little more time and analysis. But I think with a powerful means of analysis, we're at least starting those discussions. So if Meta, back when it was Facebook only, if it had started out thinking seriously about privacy rights and knowing that the psychological impact it has on teenagers is a very negative one. For example, higher suicide rates among teenage girls who scroll through fashion models, who follow a lot of influencers who are very thin and seemingly perfect. Also higher rates of anorexia, bulimia, and various mental health outcomes that are very negative. They have that research. They've known that research for about 15 years, And instead of doing the ethical thing and saying, let's find a way to mitigate our negative impact, let's explore this, they doubled down on it and said, well, this is great. If we're addictive, then we're going to make more advertising revenue because we can keep people scrolling longer and we can charge more for the ads that come later. And we can keep these people going and target them. And that is, to me, that is patently unethical. But because they are a cyber sovereign, they haven't been punished to any meaningful extent, and they haven't changed that negative behavior to any real extent either. And so that ends on a very cynical note. I'm sorry. Let me show you one more chart before I end on such a cynical note. And I'll give you this example. This is one way that my good colleague and friend Tim Coombs and I have tried to contextualize studying ethics within the situational theory of crisis communication, or his situational crisis communication theory, looking at what types of crises are happening and where they would fall on the deontological type of analysis that I've been talking about, and realizing that some are more germane to other types of activities, such as if you're a victim, you can diminish the impact, but you can rotate these forms or these shapes on the screen. You can rotate them to complete a more thorough analysis. So you could turn the square and think about each point of the star and the triangle with each corner of the square. And you can rotate the star in the middle. It requires sort of a three-dimensional imagination to think about that, but you could literally copy it and cut it out and turn it around to use as an analysis tool. And I hope that that will help people face the types of crises and challenges that we are facing today with a little bit more thorough consideration of their responsibilities, using rationality rather than just emotion, which is easily manipulated, thinking about moral autonomy, dignity and respect, and maintaining good intention in those decisions. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can discuss. I'll be happy to put something back up if you would like to see it again, but I find it easier to discuss when I can see you guys rather than just the screen. So I'm happy to just hear your comments. You don't even have to have a real formulated question. It's great if you do, but I would love to hear your comments on trying to integrate all of this work, because it's a lot to fit in. And I'm delighted that you're here and you stuck with me. So thank you.
Ma'am.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Yesterday we had practical exercise with my students, and we talk about the how to say special centers for children, like for orphans.
Right.
I don't know how to call it correctly in English. So, and they claim that should be done something about the professionals of the staff, violence in there, and so on. So there are a lot of issues in there.
Yes.
But from other side, we have a very serious problem that a lot of Ukrainian children were, how to say, stealed by Russia to actually from Ukraine to Russia. Even Russia sources say that around 700,000 of children were, how to say, moved from Ukrainian territory to Russia, which is absolutely a violation of UN Convention of the Right of the Child, because they are changing their names, they're changing their identity, they're placing on these kids on the Russian families and so on. Now the question about the ethics. We know that we have problems in these facilities, in these institutions, Ukraine. How we can criticize them when we are in war and the Russia as an aggressor might use this criticism in their behalf? Because for example, they can say, okay, there are a lot of questions in these institutions. We took this child, bring it to Russia, and someone with money, with wealth, with status, uh, how say, will take care of that child. So that might be on the benefit of that child. You know, a lot of ethical implication. Yes.
Yeah, I think that you're right, because anything you say critical of your own response is going to appear in Russian propaganda and misinformation rapidly. And so you have to be very cognizant of that and focus on the positives or on the things that you can do. But you're right, this is not, it doesn't fall in line with just war theory. It doesn't fall in line with the UN conventions on human rights. It's a clear violation of all of those things. And so to bring that to the attention of the world stage, I think is probably a more important task than criticizing the orphanage institutions or the government agency that runs those, because again, they're in crisis mode and they're doing the best they can, I'm sure, but I know that they have many problems and losses. And so this to me is one of the biggest reasons that ethical people, those who are moral, can't look away from what's going on a war front. And we've got two active ongoing wars that we're following, but to highlight the human condition and how it impacts non-combatants such as children, I think really shows us why we should have moral outrage and how that moral outrage could be used in public policy to create something that helps Ukraine, that helps the orphanages, that helps identify these children and rehome them if it's possible eventually. So that's a really great question, a horrible and complex example. And unfortunately, there are too many of those today. Thank you, Dmitrio. It's very heartbreaking to know what's going on inside from your perspective as well, because
my name is very easy. You take metro and just add the metro. That's very easy.
Nice. I like that. That's very easy. Thank you. But I appreciate you sharing that with us, because we are only getting a fraction of the information in the US of what's truly going on there. And we really are not getting much about the human rights violations to non-combatants. And we can speculate on all of the reasons for that, but it's harder to find than the general, Kyiv fell or they took a seaport city. That's pretty much the news that we get.
Yeah, that's a very serious issue.
Mm-hmm.
In 20th century, we had that issue for Ukraine when after the collapse of Russian Empire, the Ukrainian Republic rise, and when the first government of independent Ukraine started to work, so a lot of people started to criticize it, that they didn't do the wrong stuff and blah blah blah, and they had a military coup to take it out this because it was like a socialist movement, so military men decided that that's not right, and let them kick them out, and blah blah blah, and then socialist people made a revenge, and so on. But what actually all these disputes between the society caused that Russians and Soviets, they just took out the whole land. So this is like a sad story. Yes, that's why we didn't want to how to say to say it in English, to make it to do it another time.
Right. It's a very tough situation, and I think we've seen so many violations of ethics in terms of just war theory. There is an ethics of war that goes back as long as war itself, believe it or not. It's a very ancient school of thought, and we've seen a number of violations that should result in a ton of moral outrage, and hopefully that will help with ending this quickly and getting things back on a more ethical course. But thank you for that comment. That's great. Dean, I know you've been waiting a while, so do you have a question or a comment?
Sorry, Dean.
No, that's quite all right. I enjoyed the interchange. First of all, I applaud and second everything that you said here, but I also want to drill down a little deeper. This doesn't negate anything you said, but it all starts with the assumption that we, whoever the social actor is, wants to be ethical, to which you have to say why. My colleague Marina one time, which was hilarious, she said, she thought I was going to react negatively to something. She said, I don't want to annoy you with my goodness, which was hilarious because it assumed that she was good, which she is, but also I would be goodness there. But I also remember Idi Amin in Uganda one time, some news reporter says, well, you know, people are saying this, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I don't care. And so he didn't care about public opinion. He didn't care about his own set, which is one reason you want to be, you know, a pragmatic reason. And the other is your own feelings of that, you know, you're nothing dissonant going on there.
Right.
Paul Newman in some movie, I can't remember, he was going to settle something with a gunfight, a fast draw thing. And he told his colleague, this guy wins, shoot him. In other words, he expand on that. But I guess what I'm saying, and again, it doesn't take issue with anything, but it's almost like Adolf Hitler had an ideology and he was convinced he was right, you know, and obviously there's some people who are going to lose it. I don't know about Attila the Hun, if he was concerned, stayed up at night swearing about, you know, the moral reasoning that he was going through. I kind of doubted, but I didn't know him personally. But what I'm saying is that it all begins with the assumption that a person wants to be good, and generally it'd be for public opinion so other people don't think ill of you. Or secondly, that I myself have this dissonance or like, yeah, I hate myself because I'm a jerk, you know, type of thing. And I don't know if there's a question there, but it all kind of, I like where you're coming from, Shannon, like, hey, we want to do the right thing. How do we do the right thing? How do we decide that? But there's also something where, you know, you drill down, like, does this person want to, you know, or does this person not care? And the other thing that, and I'll be quiet here, but the other thing that also amazes me here, and it's really put the US in a quandary here. We're always quick to not have to think, which means tell us who the good guys are, who are the bad guys. And okay, Ukraine, that's kind of easy to figure out. I'm being presumptuous again, but because they were attacked, also Russia monolithically was an enemy during the Cold War. So the Ukrainians are the good guys here. And again, I wouldn't take any issue with that. What really was a quandary, though, is Israel, because certainly among Christians in the United States, there's, although all three religions are people of the book, but there's an affinity You say, okay, here's Muslim. You say, Muslim terrorists. They fly airplanes into the, World Trade Center. Or, my gosh, the historical Christian study, the Old Testament and the law and everything. So it should be very, to me, and again, my thinking
Yeah.
here, right? But okay, who are the good guys? Israelis. Who are the bad guys? The Hamas. And I've really been shocked in this country, without making a judgment one way or the other, that the amount of, I thought there'd be this overwhelming support of Israel in the United States, and there isn't. If anything, I mean, I don't have exact reading on this, but if anything, it
Yeah.
seems like Palestinians are saying, well, wait, we're kind of the victim. Sure, they killed people, blah, blah, blah. But, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, these are several points that prompted me here, and I don't expect any brilliant answers because I don't think there are any. If anybody could do it, you could, Shannon. But I just toss these out as things I do.
Thank you, Dean. Those are great points. And, we could discuss these things like all night, but I was trying to be really concise. But I do think that when we assume that there is an ethicality behind what we're doing, we assume that strategic communication or public relations is a profession. We assume that we want to help further honest, good, right understandings and communication. That might be too much of an assumption in some places, especially in warfare. I'm writing right now on artificial intelligence use in warfare, and you really cannot assume that there's a presumption of ethicality there. It depends on who the actor is and what their intention is when they're disseminating misinformation. Is it because they're trying to redirect terrorists away from hostages, or is it because they're trying to create terrorists? I think you really have to go to the intention behind it, and that's very difficult. But I also think that we're overlooking one vital component that touches on your second point, and that's we're trying to pursue being a civilization, right? We're trying to further the goals of civil society, civil discourse and dialogue, and civilization. You can't have that without ethical behavior. So yes, you can have an Idi Amin, you can have horrible dictators, but they eventually inspire revolution or more evil dictators to come in and challenge them, or militias to rise up. They're not stable forms of government when they're incredibly unethical. They may be stable for a while, like North Korea, for example, but their violations of human rights are disenfranchising them from much of the rest of the world. And so I think we have to view ethics in terms of creating civil society, civilization, allowing a division of labor that was not present when we were just a warring nomadic society or an agrarian society. Even it allows us to do things that become specialized. It allows us to not worry about paving roads and national defense if we're doing research on the human genome, for example. So it does give us the ability to further civilization. But without ethics, civilization crumbles. It becomes a very untenable, not lasting society if you have an assumption that everyone is potentially behaving unethically. And I'm afraid that's what pragmatist philosophy leads to, and zero-sum games where we have a lot of fierce competition for ourselves. That can lead to abuses of power, dictatorships, and so on. So, but it's a wonderful point that I think that would have been a better context for the talk if I had started there. Thank you. Okay.
I think Chu King was next.
Yes. Thank you for the vibrant discussion. I want to bring the discussion back to corporate communication, which is something that I study. So we know that transparency can be operationalized or manifested in many different ways. Sometimes it's the substantial information. Sometimes it's whether it's positive and negative information. And sometimes it's whether the information is two-way and interactive. So my question is that, is it the more the better? What would be the fine line between transparency versus a strategic ambiguity, or quote, Dean's previous words, pseudo transparency? I'm asking this because of my own research. I have 3 examples that makes me very confused about this, if I could share. So the first one is that in my CSR research based on social media communication, I consistently found that when CSR information reflects on more substantial information as part of the transparency indicator, the less the information can be resonate with audience in terms of likes, comments, and public engagement. And my recent study also found that during the COVID time, when leadership emphasized transparency, employees actually feel less trust about this leader, partly because this is an overshare or overexposure of the leader's true self at the workplace. And there has been ongoing debate on to what extent you should share your true self or personal self versus professional self in a workplace. And the third example would be, I study corporate social responsibility and ESG in the oil and gas industry, which is a very tricky and a controversial industry. Well, transparency is highly recommended. However, it seems like to those companies, when they use transparency as a strategy, it's like, okay, you need some transparency, I give you this, but it does not change anything, right? Because will you give up driving? You won't. But you want me to say something, now I give you. So we're even. So in that context, it seems like transparency will not actually help or change any social reality. Then in those situations, how do we treat this fine line between pseudo transparency versus the true transparency? And is Compton's deontological perspective always applicable to this, or should we switch to a little bit to the virtual ethics to find this golden mean or something like that? I just want to hear what you think. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great questions. And it sounds like you have a really interesting, fantastic topic to keep exploring. So I think transparency itself can be a problematic term because it's misunderstood and misused so often. And it's thrown out there to mean we told you, it's thrown out there to obfuscate. It's also used to say, I let you see. But like you said, it doesn't imply a willingness to change. It doesn't imply symmetry. It doesn't imply dialogue. And I think intention is probably the best concept that you asked, what could we use like in addition or beyond that? I think intention would gauge what the transparency is about. So we might call it disclosure, and then we might ask, what's the context that you need the information for? What are you looking for? How can I disclose in a way that's helpful? Because my intention is not to hide things, but to provide assistance in all of the facts and research about this question. And if you did that, I think that allows the deontological perspective to help you with furthering those goals. So mutual understanding really happens rather than just transparency for its own sake. And I do think virtue ethics is really helpful. The thing is, Kantian deontology is based on virtue ethics, so I feel like this is part of that, but it's not as hindsight based, and it's not as retrospective and practice based. So in order to become ethical, for example, you're supposed to have a habit that you practice, and then you become more and more ethical. You build your character over time. That really is very similar to thinking about the duty that you operate from for making a decision, and the dignity and respect you hold for others, and acting with good moral intention. Those terms just give you a way to operationalize building a good character. And it's a little bit more of an analysis tool, because you really have to do reflective engagement with yourself to think about building good character and to reflect on your past decisions and those of the organization. You can learn from those in a hindsight sense, and that gives you a more full and robust understanding from virtue ethics. But oftentimes organizations are very resistant to do that because of pressures to meet bottom line goals, quarterly earnings statements, or do you have to make a decision right then, etc. And so I think having something that's a little more rapidly implementable is easier to argue from than let's think about the virtue of our action. Have we acted with beneficence toward our stakeholders and publics? Have we acted with temperance and fortitude? Those are wonderful concepts, but they do require us to take a little bit of a step back. I hope that helps.
Thank you
Great
so much.
question. Thank you. And Shima, I think you might have shared the article. Thank you so much for putting that in the chat. I think someone did, at least. I saw it a minute ago, but it's gone up the scroll now. Thank
Yes.
you.
I'm looking forward to reading that. Thank you so much for this great discussion. I'm wondering what us as academics can do to encourage organizations to consider ethics more proactively. You referred to the practice of how organizations consider it very reactively as a response, or you for example, sometimes it's not the most natural response to consider ethics. For example, you referred to Maslow's hierarchy during disasters. So what us as academics can do to push considering ethics towards more proactivity, so that organizations consider it more proactively?
That's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it too, because I think it was Sue who was also studying disasters. So I wanted to bring that in just a little bit because I have done some interesting research on that. But I believe as academics, we have to push the normative ideal of being ethical before something unethical happens, in order to keep the organization's resources maximized, to help with our efficiencies, to also keep people out of jail, to keep them from engaging in activities that are illegal. I hate to go to that level of a threat, but sometimes it does work when you're talking about your CEOs and your dominant coalitions. As scholars, I think we also have to talk about ethics as our responsibility to push this forward. Because if we don't think about ethics, who's going to? It might fall to a group of philosophers over on campus in the philosophy department. I'm sure they're thinking about ethics, but they're probably never going to have a way to implement that into corporate decision-making and that of governments and NGOs as well. We have that opportunity. And so I believe it's incumbent upon us to help our students understand how to have those conversations and how to win those conversations. One of the ways that I have them do that, it's actually coming up next week. We have case study presentations where my students each pick an organization. Most of them are corporations, and they look at a bad example of what these organizations have done wrong. Most of them have caused a crisis for themselves by ignoring something till the point of recall, or by allowing employee relations to get so strained there's a labor union strike, etc. We have a number of horrible examples going on at any given time. And so I think if we look at those case examples of what has happened in the real world, and some of the bigger dramatic examples might even be helpful, like the collapse of Enron or the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the loss of life, the loss of dollars with the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. And there's just so many examples that it's hard to choose one, but you should probably have a few of those in mind as well when you're making these arguments, because you can avoid most of those negative outcomes by acting with ethical rectitude. And I saw that Bob joined us a while ago. I'm so glad you're here, Bob. Thank you. He and I had published some research on Enron many years ago. I think we published it in 2005 or something on. Yeah, exactly. But that is a great example of how unethical behavior can spoil the entire enterprise, collapse an organization, destroy careers, cause families to disband. People were committing suicide. People died in federal prison. And it was all because they were pushing innovate as their main value. And so Bob and I looked at their code of conduct, which was 64 pages long. And I think ethics was mentioned once on the first page in the introduction by Ken Lay, who said, we're going to be an ethical company who pursues innovation at almost any cost. And so those yeah, I'm sorry, Bob, go ahead, jump in there.
That document was primarily designed to protect the company,
yes,
from criticism, not to criticize the company in a proactive, constructive way to the community.
Exactly. And much of it was simple code of conduct stuff like do not use Enron computers for your personal computing needs at home. You know, do not discuss Enron trades and activities outside of the office in any environment where you could be overheard. Do not, and it just, you know, it went on and on. But I think that those examples offer us a way to show the importance of ethical behavior, even if we're arguing it from sort of the negative case, look how bad it was, look what happened. Then we can sort of dangle the carrot of, wouldn't you rather have long-term good relationships with your stakeholders, with the news media, with your stockholders? Wouldn't you rather be seen as a good corporate citizen by your government regulatory agencies and your employees than someone who exploits the environment and really does not have any moral rectitude regarding how others are treated? So I think those are some helpful answers, I hope. And I've also done some disaster research on crisis, but I just saw Sue said she had to leave, which is too bad. But using artificial intelligence for public affairs in the hurricane disaster scenario here in South Carolina with all of our flooding has been a very interesting way to also think about ethics. And there we oftentimes come to the digital divide in terms of the haves and have-nots. The people who are more affluent tend to get help first in a crisis in advance of the people who are not so affluent, don't have social media connections in the internet, or don't speak English. And that's really an ethical failing as a society. Yes, Michael.
Well, I just had a couple observations too earlier for some of the points you made that I think are worth thinking about.
Right.
You mentioned sort of this confusing of or confounding maybe of sort of legal and ethical in these classes that sort of purport to be teaching ethics, but really it's more about legal. And we see that in JMC schools all the time where, you know, my colleagues in advertising used to, you know, one of my colleagues, Jim Avery, used to always come up to me and say, oh, did you see the scandal with whatever, you know, PR is so bad, so sleazy, so unethical. And you know, at the time I didn't have a response to it because he would just sort of surprise me in the hall with this, you know, with some stupid question. So then I started paying attention to advertising, and one day he came out with this, and I said, "Oh, really? Well, did you notice this, you know, whatever in advertising?" And he said to me, "Did they break the law?" And I'm like, "What difference does it make? That's not what ethics is." And he kept insisting, right? It's about, you know, if we didn't break the law, we didn't do anything wrong. So I actually sort of adopted that just with him and would say the same thing, like, did they break the law, Jim? Did we break the law? But the fact is that for advertising, there is no code of ethics for most advertising, you know, departments or agencies. And their code of ethics is, did we break the law? So that's a key thing. And then the other thing is just that if you look at these sociopaths who run these companies like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, they didn't study anything in the humanities. Zuckerberg didn't even graduate from college. And when he was there, he studied computer science. So it's hardly surprising that these people have no concept of what ethics really is, except for some, distorted view, from the media, they're not being treated fairly, so that's unethical, that they've never learned what it means to be, to be empathetic or sympathetic.
Right. And they wield the power of nation states through their resources, lobbying, access to information, denial of information, support for various causes, all the while exploiting people who use their service, like the addictive clicks and likes on Facebook. And so I think it is incredibly ethically problematic. Great point. Does anyone else have some comments or questions?
Earlier, and I apologize for not getting here. I was saving the world. Anyway, I can quickly give you an idea of that. We had a flood out here a number of years ago associated with Harvey, and a lot of people lost their houses, lost their property, and all of that sort of thing. Yeah. And so turn to the county was dysfunctional, turn to the federal government, and it takes 2 years to get anything done. And so some grassroots organizations developed, and we just went out of business because we had built a lot of houses for a lot of people, and at some point just given them the keys to the houses. And it's an interesting problem with community relations, because when you do that to help people who have genuinely lost everything, people who lost nothing, but now don't have as good as those people do, are pissed. Why didn't I get something? Well, you didn't lose anything. Well, okay, well, you have to lose something to get something. So this whole notion of satisfying people, I've just about given up. But more importantly, back to the concept that you were talking about a while ago, including transparency, information, disinformation, and as Shannon may know, I don't know whether she's got around to reading my chapter or not. I got fascinated about 30 years ago and then did nothing with it for the longest time on this notion of a concept that I now call fact agency. And one of the reasons that I renewed my interest in it was because of a former president of the United States for whom truth has no place, fact has no reality. And the question that I ask in terms of fact agency, which also ties into information, disinformation, and so forth, is to what extent can a community survive, let alone function well, if it does not have fact agency? And briefly, I would define fact agency as the ability to agree as a community on what is factual. And part of that, in that article or chapter from Shannon, I also tie in with a concept that I discovered not long ago called the Anthropocene. And that is, we now, for the first time in the history of looking at geological ages, are now trying to figure out the effect that humans have on the environment and geology, et cetera, right, rather than the opposite, what the world has done to affect life forms, including human forms. And so this whole notion of fact is arguably there, but the unwillingness or the inability to discover it and to do so in a communitarian way, to use Brother Kuckerberg's favorite word, that it all benefits in various ways those of us. We can't have a community arguably without fact agency. This goes back to the notion of your dictators and so forth, without an agreement. Yes. As ethics are. Do we have to agree
absolutely
upon
does.
And so forth and so forth and so forth. So I would suggest, I look forward to all of you telling me what the hell fact agency is.
I love it. I think that's a wonderful way to operationalize the concept I was talking about of that civilization can't exist without ethics, that we have to have a bottom line agreement on what the truth is, what reality is, before we can move forward. And I think fact agency is a great way to put that, Bob. So I'm going to have to read that chapter. It sounds fascinating. Dean, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was intrigued with well, everybody here, but certainly Bob. I also remember working in the Middle East, we were doing case studies, not at Arab Emirates, and we were interviewing a CEO of oil. I think I remember the company, but I won't say because I'm not sure. But anyhow, it was interesting because he said he always traveled with his attorney and he always traveled with his PR person, which we thought, hey, that's great. But he was talking, and some of this might have been with Sharia law and, you know, and Muslim, you know, like Christian tithing, things like that. But he was saying, oh, my company does this, and it wasn't political or benefit, just, you know, good contributing to humanity, to causes, to people down, you know, whatever the case was. And so my colleague, which was a reasonable question, says, well, are you letting people know about this? You know, for the obvious, you know, corporate social responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, no, we don't want to do that. That's not why we're doing it. And that really, because, you know, when people do it, I believe, and I shouldn't be fast and loose with this, but I think with McDonald's after 9/11, they would spend more money telling people about what they did than they actually spent on, you know, helping people.
Doing it.
In the textbook,
Yeah.
and the other thing, I also hesitate doing this, but it might be some of the countries because the comments very we struggle with this. I think we did a good job, but Katarina, in my book on transparency, public relations, and the mass media, we really try to explicate some of these concepts that you're talking about. This is a 2017 book. But there's a section there where we really, I mean, like I say, where we succeeded or not, it was really difficult. And the other was, Marina and I did this in 2016, a PR inquiry. We talked about pitfalls and promises of transparency in the digital age. And what it essentially means, what you were alluding to, I think, is that, hey, transparency is not a tool for public, you know, to be abused. It's not a tool to get goodwill. What is it? Brad Rollins and Kevin Stoker, some of them over the years done some things with translucency and so forth. So there's some interesting thoughts. So I really hate promoting my own stuff. I mean, it just seems like maybe that would be helpful to some of the international people, the grad students who might not run into that. But we struggle with this, and like I say, I think there's some value to it. So anyhow, that's my self-promotion.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up because there has been a lot of research done around that term and other terms that I think is very valuable. In terms of furthering ethics in public relations, I always go back to the moral philosophers and see what they're calling it and how they discuss the terms before incorporating it, because they really have a longer tradition of studying these than we do. But I think we've done a very good job, Dean and Katarina, Dean and Maureen, I think we've done a good job of kicking off that study and helping build out the literature in public relations. Because like I said before, there's very little of it. When I first started studying this, it was Don Wright, Tom Bivens, a couple other folks, and Dean had a couple articles, but honestly, it was not a lot of people with a lot of literature to build upon. Now I feel like I can have a robust literature review and lots of citations. And I think that shows that our field is one that is a profession and that we do want to grow in a way that helps further society and civil society and engagement within it. But we have to have that intention. Of course, it can be used for all the wrong reasons, as we've also seen. And as Michael pointed out, people can agree on the facts, but they have gain goals. They have personal goals in mind, or they want to stay the dictator, or etc. So I think that's obviously the challenge that goes back to the problem of evil we talked about earlier, and how to root that out from our organizations and try to act with good intention all the time. Are there any other questions or comments? Hi, Flora.
Hi, Shannon, and I enjoyed the discussion. And then I just want to move the discussion a little bit over to the societal and the political context, because right now we have seen a lot of polarization in the society, especially when it comes to election, not just only in the Western world, but also currently, like in Taiwan. Maybe some of you have known that we are going to have the election in January. And then we know, I thought of what this Russian writer said before. He said, they know they are telling a lie. We know they are telling a lie. So everybody know that there is a lie there. But it seems that those who are in power, let the lie continues in order, like what discussed earlier. They want to keep their power. But the thing is, look at the poll in Taiwan. No matter what certain political parties say, this is a lie. Their party supporters also know it is a lie, but they still maintain like 30% of support rate, in the society. So I thought that, this effect of echo chamber, people, they believe in certain kind of ideology. So it doesn't matter how much truth that we provide through the media, through interpersonal conversation, they still believe what they want to believe. And that further cause more social polarization. So then I am thinking, to what extent, there is a limit of ethics. We keep saying that ethics is important, but when it comes to like maintaining power, or when it comes to the election, it seems that ethics is putting aside. People just want to believe. There are certain dead heart people. They just want to support their parties or the politicians. Yeah, so it is kind of sad, isn't it, that no matter what we said, like ethics is important. And then in the political context, there seems like, to some extent, ethic cannot have too much effect.
Exactly. And I think that is a basic flaw in the paradigm that we're looking for mutually beneficial outcomes, because you can't always have those mutually beneficial outcomes in a case like you described. And Bob and I did a study on that, and we published it in 2020, where we talked about how strategic issues management and using strategic intelligences was better for ethical decision-making and overall organizational decision-making than continuing to seek agreement. I guess sometimes you just have to realize that the other side will never agree. And we use the case of climate change. Bob actually had done the lion's share of the work on that case study, and it was a very good one, because it's an issue where we're just never going to see agreement. And I don't think we can look for mutual understanding when we have two sides so polarized that neither one wants to have mutual agreement. And so we concluded it in thinking about strategic intelligences and using issues management to further your arguments, your research, and your efficacy, rather than seeking the ephemeral, mutually beneficial outcome. Interesting piece. Thank you, Flora.
Okay, well, I think everybody's had a chance to ask at least one or two questions. It's getting late there for Shannon, and she probably needs to go have a glass of wine or something. So why don't we wrap this up for today? And thanks everybody for coming. Any final comments anybody wants to make, or questions real quick? Okay. I appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording now. And then, of course, if you have anything you want to share, you can do that after the recording stops.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate everybody's time.